And we are live. Hi, Vivienne, how are you?
Good. I'm good, really good.
It is a pleasure to meet you. We've just been having a brief chat, and I could hear you talk for hours. Um, but we had to start recording at some point, so here we are. A quick reminder to those who have just joined us on our journey. This is Pride in the Living Room, Jewmos edition. And this is a project that was founded by the Israeli LGBT task force Agudah in memory of the 2009 Tel Aviv Gay Center shooting and the Jerusalem Pride Parade stabbing in 2015. And Agudah founded this project to offer a voice and a stage to LGBT Jews from around the world to share their stories, encouraging empathy and community. So I would love to welcome Dr. Vivienne Cass to the stage. You are a clinical psychologist, a lecturer. You're an author. You've published publications on about sexuality, gender identity, AIDS, and in terms of your Jewish story, in 1975, you authored this chapter called Coming Out Kosher Style, which went viral, the 1975 version of viral.
Yes, exactly.
And, uh, and you also founded the first Jewish gay group Jewish LGBT group in Australia called Chutzpah.
Mm.
And, I'm really excited to hear your stories. So, Dr. Vivienne, over to you.
Well, thank you, Jared. Yes, I was very much an activist back in the early days in the 70s. So it's probably hard for some of the people, listening to this podcast to actually think about what it might be like to be gay and Jewish in the 1970s. And it was pretty raw, really, because you can imagine that, I was only 22 when I first met a woman that I fell in love with. And before that, I was doing the whole Jewish dating thing that you do. I had been a Jewish debutante and I was hanging out with Jewish boys and very involved with my local synagogue. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, this happened, I just fell in love with this woman. So that was pretty amazing. And I thought it was great, because I do remember the first time I became aware of my feelings. I was thinking to myself, oh, I'm one of those. And it suddenly hit me, because you've got to remember, in those days, the word gay wasn't used. Certainly not even the word lesbian was used. It was all homosexuality. It was pretty heavy duty stuff. And but the only thing I could think of was that now it would fit more with my feminist background at that stage. And I didn't have to try and get married and, do the grandchildren for my mother that she had been on my back about for so long. So, but that's it. So I was 22, and for the first couple of years, the whole thing was just kept hidden. Like, my partner and I just lived our own little life. We didn't know anyone else. We thought that was, we were just being who we were, and that was fine. And it was interesting, because at that time, there didn't seem to be any particular conflicts with my Jewishness. I was still going to, my mother's on a Friday night and doing all those normal Jewish things on my own, of course, not with my partner. And it wasn't until we'd been together a couple of years, so I was by this stage now 24, and I thought, this is absolutely crazy, all this making up stories about where I'm going and what I'm doing, when really I'm in this very wonderful, loving relationship. So I decided, and this is where the coming out kosher style starts, you see. So I decided then I was going to tell my family, and I spent ages, months and months and months, thinking about it, trying to work out what to say and do. And finally, one day I got the courage, and I had decided, let's not try and tell all the family all at once. That's just really going too far. Let's just pick them off one time. So I called into my mother's place and got all ready to tell her. And just as I was opening my mouth, the doorbell went and somebody was visiting. So I had to shut my mouth again, go home, and then it took me about another 2 or 3 months before I could get the courage to start off again. Yeah, so then finally I did tell her. And of course, as you can imagine, with a Jewish mother in those days, she was absolutely shocked, immediately disliked my partner and said I had been, taken advantage of, and then she started crying. And she cried, I think, for 2 weeks, probably without stopping, maybe even longer. And so I had to sort of deal with that. But I just felt right for me to say something. And then she said, now don't tell anyone else. Don't let anyone in the Jewish community know, because, you'll get completely rejected. So, but I wanted to tell my sister, and then I had 2 brothers. My sister cried a bit when I asked her why. She didn't know. When I told my brothers, they just went, oh, cool, it's great. Yeah, so that was fine. So I got through that. And then later on, I told my father. Now, it was interesting because he said to me, I think you should analyse yourself out of it. Now, this stage, I think I was starting off on a second psychology degree. So he can imagine him thinking, oh, no, analyse yourself out of it. But of course, the problem was when I said, look, I'm actually happy in this relationship, then that just kind of flummoxed them. But so basically I came out and told them. But then I had this problem of going into the Jewish community, and then still people saying to me, oh, so when are you going to get married, and when are you going to, do you want to have kids, and all this sort of stuff. So I don't know, does that happen nowadays in the Jewish community, Jared? Do you think?
Sometimes.
Mm-hmm. So there's still that pressure? Yeah.
I only have a sample size of 1, but from the people I've interviewed, some of them have felt it definitely, yeah. For yourself?
Well, it was very strong then. So, but here's the thing. So I actually came out accidentally to the whole Jewish community in Perth. In those days, it was only about 4,000, right? But it might have been 100,000, wouldn't have mattered. So here's what happened. I decided as a psychologist, a trainee psychologist, that I was going to set up a group for Jewish, gay, lesbian, bisexual and transvestite people. And the reason I had those little groups was I did know a Jewish, what we call transvestite, then now we'd say cross-dresser or trans, right? And he was Jewish and he was married. I also knew a couple of Jewish guys who were married who I also knew had boyfriends, right? So I thought, well, that's it. I could get a group going, and if I say I'm a psychologist, then that's all right. They'll think that I'm just being this nice, compassionate person, and it'll all look very legit, you see. So then I couldn't work out how to let people know. So I decided I would put an advertisement in our local Jewish newspaper, right? Well, I was extremely naive, of course. I actually thought they would, but of course they wouldn't even think about it. It was like, don't even bother to come back with us. So then I was stymied there until one day a friend of mine, who was a social worker, said, oh, I'm just going to take a temporary position as the editor on the Jewish newspaper while the editor's away on holidays. And he said, would you like me to put that ad in that you were telling me about? And I said, yes, please. And so he did. Right, so there it was, right in the middle of the newspaper, this ad with these words, gay or homosexual, transvestite, bisexual. And it caused a huge, reaction. And of course, people just put 2 and 2 together and made the assumption that it was because I was a lesbian. So then a few weeks after that ad went in, my brother got married, and I turned up at this wedding, all nicely dressed and everything. And people came up to me and said, oh, I really admire your courage, or amazing that you did that, or good on you, or something, which of course my mother wasn't too happy about because she was absolutely beside herself with shock. at it, you see. So anyway, that's how I got to come out to 4,000 people all at once, which was much easier, I must tell you, than actually telling my family, I can assure you.
My
So,
goodness.
yeah, so
Wow.
that's the story of the coming out. And I mean, you've got to remember that in those days, I mean, nobody was like, I knew there were some people who I was pretty sure were gay or lesbian who actually would cross the street or cross the room when I came in because I was so frightened and associated with it. That's how fearful people were. But then from there, I decided that I would, I don't know, I was obviously a glutton for punishment or something, because I just thought, well, I'm going to really go ahead and set up this group and make it work. And then I had read about a group in London called Chutzpah, and I spoke with the people there. Of course, it wasn't email or anything, it was all letters. And so I decided I'd set up the Chutzpah group here. And, you know, I actually had a father of a boy ring me, of a gay guy, and the father rang and said, I've heard about this group and I really want my son, who was at that stage only 16 and still at school, I really want him to come to your group because I'd like him to meet a nice Jewish boy. So I was, you know, I thought that to me was the epitome of acceptance. But can you imagine? I want him to meet a nice Jewish boy. So how many Jewish boys were there standing on the corner with their, you know, this Magen David on and saying, hey, I'm ready? You know, not too many at all.
So what happened next?
Well, we had regular meetings and we always had a Seder together. Second night Seder was our group. And at one point we got to about 24 people, that was with partners. That was amazing. And we had a fabulous Seder, and I always remember them because there was all sorts of very good humour. In fact, I think we were all so thrilled to be with other Jewish people who were like us, where we could just be ourselves. And many of us had partners who were not Jewish. Everybody brought their partners along. And the Jewish jokes went from one side of the table to the other. And people were just really, really in a joyful mood. You could feel it. And the only problem was nobody had any problems, right? Everybody was actually very happy about, you know, being gay or lesbian, or perhaps I think we had some bisexual people there. Everyone was quite adjusted compared where lots of other people were in the world at that stage. The Jewishness actually, because I mean, you've got to remember that in those days, huge numbers of religious people, non-Jewish religious people, were struggling, really struggling. And by this stage, you know, I was a psychologist also, and working with people who would come to me who were Mormons or Seventh-day Adventists or just plain Christians who were having the most horrific experiences and, you know, wanting to suicide or dealing with parents who were throwing them out of home and so on. And here we were, this little bunch of Jewish people with not a problem between us. And so in a way that actually helped the group to dissolve after a few years, because, you know, we all kind of led our lives in quite accepting ways. But it was a bit of a shame that we did dissolve. I'm not quite sure why we did. It got quite big. But people just, you know, people got on with lives. They were moving into careers and so on, you know. But the contrast between we Jewish people in our acceptance and the non-Jewish people was quite stark. You know, the other thing I set up in 1974 was the gay and lesbian, well, we called it then a homosexual counselling service. And I set that up because I was getting phone calls from all these people who were really struggling with being gay. And I remember one time a young boy coming to me, and he was from the country, and when his father found out that he was gay, he was just immediately banished from home. And so he came to the city. Well, he knew nobody, had no one around, no supports and so on. And it was very hard to find a Christian group that, because he had a strong Christian background, very hard to find a group that would support him. And the only good part of that story was that even though the father had banned the mother from visiting the son and had banned the son from coming home at any time, that every now and then the mother would say to the father, "Oh, I'm just going to the city," which was like a 200-kilometre trip, right? "I'm just going to the city because I need to buy some things." And the father would say, "Okay." And when she came back, because what she was really doing was going to the city to visit her son. And when the father came back, then when the mother came back, the father would just say, "Oh, how are things?" And she'd say, "Oh, they're good." And they both knew that she was checking on the boy, so some nice kind of things that happened. But we were very lucky. In fact, the Jewishness side was important in some ideas that I began to develop around that time, because the story starts with, I was in my office, and at that stage I was working at a psychiatric hospital, and I ran a little kind of gay practice on the side, which was actually during work times. I'm never sure how that happened and why it was accepted by my superior, but I did. And one day this young woman came to me, and she absolutely loathed herself as a lesbian and was really very close to suicide, or was thinking suicide anyway. And as she left my office, I remember looking at her and thinking, I have no idea what to do to help this woman, because she was so fixed in the negativity of being gay that I just couldn't move it. And so from there, that was the little trigger for me. And I began to think about what people go through in order to come to accept themselves as in a positive way, thinking if I can work that out, then I might be able to work out what goes wrong. Well, guess who I used as case number one? So I used this Jewish lesbian, fairly fresh to the scene, and because there had been no real negativity and I was so accepting of myself, so I thought, well, if I can work out what I went through, then maybe I might be able to help her. And that was the basis of me then listening very carefully when people came to see me who were struggling with accepting their homosexuality, until one day I realised that there were some common phrases being said by a range of people, common things. And so I wrote all these down, like I had about 6 or 7 phrases, and I thought, well, that's interesting. Same things are coming up. I wonder what that means. And then one day I realised that there was an order to them, that people said this first. So they'll say things like, oh, I don't want to be different. I just can't handle being different. Or, all right, I might be gay, but I hate it, or something like that. So I ordered these things, and these phrases became the basis for what I ended up writing as 6 stages of identification, which is now known as the CAS model of gay and lesbian, or lesbian and gay identification. So I eventually got that published in 1979 after being rejected through university because I decided that I really wanted to write that up and publish it. And then I thought, well, I might as well make it a PhD since I'm on that track. And so I went to UWA, which is the only university here in Western Australia, and said, hey, I want to do this PhD, and I've got this great topic. Well, they just about freaked out. And even though I enrolled, I kept coming up against some, and till eventually my supervisor said to me, they're not going to let you keep going. They don't want this topic of identification. They can't handle it. And Murdoch University's just started, so why don't you go there and do it, which I did. So I eventually did my PhD there. And but it was pretty hard dealing with the sort of criticism that I was getting from the people at UWA. They just did not want me to go through. So was interesting. So one day it was so bad. I mean, one of the lecturers at UWA said, you know, it's awfully pretentious for this student to think that she can write a new theory. So that's the kind of thing we came up against in those days.
Well, now the CAS identity model is used all around the world.
Yes.
And it's been able to help many people, Jewish, non-Jewish, to be able to explain their identity and their journey.
Yes, it has been, you know, I mean, even now, you know, it's helpful. But the thing is, you know, like, I think, you know, we Jewish people, we want to help. We want to help others. And so the whole point of the theory was to try and guide people towards accepting themselves and not rejecting themselves for being, you know, gay. And so that's really what it's done. So I've been very pleased about that, and it's taken me on a journey of going to conferences overseas and going into all sorts of settings where I've been able to sort of talk to a lot of people, and including Jewish groups overseas. I don't think I've mentioned that, you know, one time when I was overseas, I had heard about Jewish gay synagogues, and had read about these, and I was very envious of people being able to go into a synagogue that would accept gay and lesbian people. And I just, in fact, I couldn't imagine it, because to be honest, I had found here that even though I was a member of the Temple David here, once I became gay, I never felt that I quite fitted in. I would go to a service and I would always hold back. I always feel like I didn't belong. It was a very strong feeling, and one that really made me feel like I was on the outside rather than the inside. And so the thought of going to a gay synagogue was like beyond my wildest dreams. So one time when I was overseas, there were actually a couple of times when I visited synagogues. Once when I was in San Francisco, and I went to into this synagogue, and there was not only was there a gay rabbi, it was a lesbian rabbi who was running the service. And to me, that was like, again, an amazing thing to do. And one of the I can remember at one point going to this service, and they called up people who were in a relationship, and I said, does anyone want their relationship blessed? It was as simple as that. I remember when the days gay marriage were on the horizon, okay, and people were still being jailed for homosexuality in these days. So to think of that was amazing. So I sat there in the congregation and I watched these couples come up as couples very proudly and happily and get blessed by the rabbi. And to be honest, I was just in floods of tears, because it was so joyful to have that level of acceptance, you know, compared to what I was used to. And then I remember once I was in New York and I went to the gay synagogue there, and they were having a big gala dinner. And so I was invited to go along there. And so I was actually in a room, a massive ballroom, done as only the Americans can do, full of, I don't know, 100 Jewish, gay, lesbian, I don't know what they were, people. And that was very, very, that was just a fabulous experience. So those things kept me going, because when I came back to Perth, I still had the feeling of like not quite fitting in. So that's why we need the worldwide Jewish, groups, gay groups throughout, because there are still some areas, I think, in the world where Jewish people still don't feel like, like if you come from a small town, small country place and so on, it's very, very hard to feel like you belong.
Hmm. You were talking about feelings of, the feeling of being outside rather than inside, and feelings of not quite fitting in.
Mm,
And I can see today, it's obvious to anyone who has a chance to hear your story or read your work that you are highly intelligent. You are in a position where you've taken what you've been through and you want to offer goodness into the world for the next generation of people, to take that experience and make the world a better place than the one that you grew up in.
absolutely, yes. And I have to say that, when I first came out in the early 70s, I became a gay activist almost like it just happened, and not quite sure how, but it was partly because I would see how people were being treated, and I get really angry, and I'd feel the injustice of it. And I was quite sure then, and I'm certainly sure now, that my Jewishness allowed me that, because my Jewishness, like when you belong to a minority group, and you learn to deal with that, and you learn to deal with it in a positive way, as we try to do, then you don't want to see other minority groups being treated badly. And so it's kind of started out that I would go out and give talks, and I had a talking buddy a guy who used to come out with me, and he was actually a lecturer in education at the University of Western Australia. So we would go out and give talks, and often they were to church groups, even a couple of times to Jewish groups, and all sorts of people who had never before met a gay person. Right? Can you imagine that? They'd never met somebody, never discussed it at all. So I go out to these groups, and of course sometimes they get a bit uptight about it, and you'd have to try but I had to learn to be calm, to tell the story. And so we had this little trick, my talking partner and I, where we would spend 10 minutes talking all about homosexuality. So I was supposedly the psychologist talking about homosexuality, and he was the educator, right? And of course, I was always dressed anyway. I always did makeup and everything because that's what I did, and I like doing it, and I still do. And so I didn't fit the stereotype of a lesbian, and he didn't fit the stereotype of a gay guy. So we would just give our general talk. And we would just happen to slip in the fact that we're also gay. And so then you grab people, because then they go, what? They couldn't believe what they were hearing. And so you could teach them. But I also did a lot of, I was also then asked from that to give a lot of like radio talks and TV interviews and things like that. And I wrote a lot of letters to the paper, letters to the editor. That was my kind of favourite thing, because I'd read something in the paper, like, for example, somebody who's just been jailed for being gay. I had a couple of friends who had been in jail just for being gay, and it affected them in a terrible way. And so those sort of things got me really mad and riled up. And I'd write off these letters to the editor, and every bit helps. It doesn't matter what you're doing to help people. Every small amount helps. You don't have to get out there and be a big star or anything. You just have to write letters, speak to people, do whatever. So I always felt that my Jewishness, Jewish values, and Jewish confidence, shall I say, my Jewish chutzpah, was the basis on which I was able to do those things. It was kind of a fun life, really. In fact, I just remembered as I was talking then that we had I can't remember the year that we had our first gay pride. Well, I suppose it was gay parade here in, I guess it was probably around 75 or 76. And it was this is the first one. So nobody had floats. We didn't think of floats or costumes, or certainly there wasn't a bit of glitter around. And we just dressed in a normal way, and we held up a big sign, and we had T-shirts with "Gay is good." I remember that, and we went around saying things like 2468, "Gay is just as good as straight." So, and these were amazing things to say out loud at the time. And so, can you imagine? There we are. We gathered together. We walked right down through the middle of the city, and people stood on the side, stared as if we were absolute like weirdos, right? They'd never, and they could not believe that these people were walking down the street actually saying they were proud of being gay. So it was an amazing time, an exciting time, but still kind of a bit scary, I suppose. Anyway, that was my stomping ground, I guess you can say.
You mentioned this a little bit in terms of you having an ad within the Australian Jewish News about this new group you were forming, which became Chutzpah. Can you talk a little bit about how the spaces that you created and the spaces that you inhabited interacted with Judaism?
That's a good question. Well, I think that my Jewishness was always important, and I think that everything I did, in a sense, I've been saying this, everything I did, somehow my Jewishness was just sitting there, guiding and informing, and my values were there, and I think that just directed me, because and maybe it's again that Jewish chutzpah that we all, we have lots of committees and lots of organizations and lots of people doing things, and we can't help ourselves, I guess. And so here I was, like I had been literally in a homosexual relationship for about 2 years, and then suddenly I'm coming out, and then I joined up with the only homosexual group, the Campaign Against Moral Persecution, which was here in Perth. And then suddenly I'm on the committee there. And then suddenly I'm setting up this counselling service. And then I'd see little things like, for example, I met some married men and who were trying to deal with being gay at the same time. And so I eventually ended up setting up a group for married gay and lesbian people and their partners. And would you believe we would have them all meet together, and one night they'd come in, the two groups would divide into separate rooms, they'd have a little chat and share their issues, then we'd all come back and we'd have a cup of tea and a biscuit and all talk together. And I mean, I really think those things come from that our desire to help others. It's just there, and our desire to organize things, probably.
So I think we left your journey when you created your CAS model, which went all around the world. What happened next?
Well, that model, that theory sort of certainly put me out there, and I got invited to, a few years later, I got invited to go and be a speaker at the Kinsey Institute. So I don't know if people are still aware of what who Kinsey was, but he was the first researcher who did a very, very detailed research project he ran on people's sexuality, finding out things about how people behave sexually that were never known before. But he did that in the 1940s, and so this was at a time when people were just craving to get information about sexuality. So then there was this institute set up at the University of Indiana, and under his name. And so it was a very big research institute, and so I was invited to go to this conference. Now, this was a very big deal because there were only 14 speakers invited from around the world, and I was the only Australian. And I was in my 30s, I guess. at this stage. And it was pretty nerve-wracking because there were a whole pile of people there who'd done research with Kinsey. You know, they were pretty old by now, but this was considered really these people were just like research gods, and they were amazing. But anyway, so I got there and they said, all right, with this conference now, what we're going to do is we're going to put you 14 speakers in a square around and sitting at tables in a square, and we want you to share your ideas. But around you, around the back of you, is another group of people, 100 people, kind of like observers, all sitting behind you and around you. And that's sort of a second tier, and then they can ask questions later. Well, some of those people, I mean, here's me, mid-30s, some of those people were the most experienced researchers in the area of homosexuality and sexuality in general that you could find in the world, and yet there they were. So it was quite amazing. But out of that, so I gave a paper, and so there was a book chapter that came out of there, and from then on I went to lots of different conferences, gay conferences and gay health conferences and so on, and produced a few more papers and so on. And what happened then? Well, then I had finished my PhD, which was a bit of a story in itself, you see. So here I am now with a PhD on homosexual identity information. And, well, I had problems actually getting that through, if I think about it, because when I was given the examiners who were going to mark that, these were 3 examiners who had never read a book on homosexuality in their lives. So that already tells you something. Here's a topic you don't want to touch. And so we're going to give you 3 examiners who considered very reputable people, because we want to, this is the university talking, of course, well, we want to keep our reputation, you know, we don't want to get it ruined by having this research go through. And so I had to deal with examiners who knew nothing about the topic. And then when finally I got it through and it was accepted, one of the examiners said, oh, it just needs some changes, a few changes here. And then the committee that was supposed to okay it put it on hold for another 6 months. So the whole thing got dragged out. But in the meantime, I'm publishing papers and I was setting up a private practice, and I'm doing a whole lot of things like that. And so that all got, you know, very interesting. And then in the mid-80s, when all this is kind of happening, AIDS comes to the world, right, which is, of course, very relevant now, given that we've got the virus here. Now, of course, AIDS went to America first, you know, that it hit there, and then it didn't come here for a bit. And in 1984, I was asked if I would set up the first psychology clinic, counselling service for people with HIV/AIDS. And this was the first one in Australia. So I gave up my practice for a couple of days a week and I set up this service. Well, I want to tell you, we were located in a hospital building attached to what was called the Communicable Diseases Department, run by a very, very straight-laced, right-winged, conservative doctor who would not even allow us to put any gay literature in the waiting room. Now, by gay literature, I don't mean we were talking, you know, magazines with naked bodies or anything. I'm saying brochures about how to stop yourself from getting AIDS, infected with HIV, right? Material that was supposed to help people, medical, you know, material. And we couldn't get that through. But that was another great experience for me, because I then I was asked to be on a national committee. So in Australia, we were very forward, much more forward than the Americans in terms of sorting out HIV. And remember that HIV was going right through the gay male community here. It was a horrible time. And so I got asked to go on a national committee to try and help sort this out. So I was doing that. But in the meantime, I was interviewing people, gay guys, who had become infected, right? So there I am. We're in a situation like now. We knew nothing about HIV. Nobody knew what it was, what was happening. And yet we had people coming in, young guys coming in. I remember particularly a young guy of 21, he'd been a state tennis champion. And he came and he'd just come to terms with being gay. He'd just come out. And then he had just, before he saw me, about 2 months before, he'd left home so he could go off and be gay and, you know, and explore the world as a young gay guy. And then he got infected with HIV. And so I was really working with him and tracking him all through that time, watching him absolutely deteriorate very quickly, because in those days we had nothing. We didn't know what to do. And then I remember one day he came to see me and he was acting in a really odd way. And he was sort of looking at his shoes and laughing and stuff. And I went, my blood ran cold. I thought, there's something happening here. There's something, you know, brain-wise happening here. And so as soon as he left, I went racing into the hospital and looked for the senior doctor who was responsible for all the HIV stuff. And I said, does HIV go to the brain? That's my question, exactly like that. And he just said to me, I don't know. I don't think we know. And I said, well, I think it might be, because I've just watched a guy doing some really weird things. And he certainly that guy, as time went on. Well, within 1 month, just 1 month of me asking that question, suddenly everybody else had the same thing happening. And people were reporting brain damage and some sort of neural, you know, problems. And it was very sad, because when that young boy, really, I call him a boy because he was just a boy, really, he had to go back and move back home, right, because he couldn't look after himself. He was so unwell. His family refused to allow him to be gay in any way, because they were from, I think they were Seventh-day Adventists. You know, he couldn't have asked for a worse situation. And there he was with his mind slowly going into dementia. And it was pretty sad. But the saddest part was when he died. And I have to tell you, at this time, it was about a funeral a week. And that was pretty hard. But when he died, I went to the funeral, as did some of the other staff who worked with me. And the minister of religion got up to talk at his funeral, and they said, of course, all these nice things, all that sort of stuff. And I remember we stood up the back, and I was so angry, because everything about this boy that was about his homosexuality was erased from that talk. There was not one mention of it. Now, to be honest, of course, now I can see in hindsight that the thought that they would say something was probably, you know, completely idealistic. But that's really how it was. So there were many funerals where the homosexuality of the young guy who had died was just obliterated from the records. So it was very sad, you know, but it was actually sadder in really in other countries, because we had, you know, we were still ahead. I remember some psychologist friends of mine in New York. Now, you've got to think about New York. Have you ever been to New York? There's in the city, there are major streets where you would walk down them and they would just be filled with gay people, gay bars, gay everything, rainbow flags everywhere. It was just total. Well, once AIDS hit, those streets just became decimated and they were empty. And my psychology friends in New York said that they were going to a funeral every day. And it was like a nightmare. Their words were like a nightmare. And so I remember talking with them at one stage and afterwards, and I said, well, how did you cope? And he said, well, what we did, we would all get together have dinner once a week just to support ourselves. But this is what we had to do. We banned the word AIDS or HIV. And if anyone wanted to say something about it, they had to use the word banana. I have no idea why banana. I'm not even going to bother to go there. But so they would have a whole dinner conversation about bananas, you see, and just try and lighten up that way. So it was a pretty devastating kind of time for them and for us here. I mean, it was really, really hard. But at the same time, we were actually educating the community, we're educating the public, because this had to be done in order to prevent, further infections. It was exactly the same thing as we're having now, where we had to go out and tell people, don't do this, don't do that, watch, this is how you sanitize and so on. So, but I have to say, I did have a book come out of that. And so as a result of my experiences with that clinic, I ended up writing a book called There's More to Sex Than AIDS, the A to Z Guide to Safe Sex. So I used to, every night I would go home and I would write one letter of the alphabet, and I tried to make it light and funny. And it was, it was quite a fun book, the A to Z Guide to Safe Sex, especially if you're trying to work out what to put under Q or Z, some of these more obscure letters. And but yeah, so that was something else that I kind of got into. I mean, this is sounding a bit like just a litany of things I did, but it's really, where life was taking me. I was on this kind of journey that was just being taken along by the whole gay side of my life, really, I suppose. But still, I would say underpinned by my Jewish values.
It sounds to me that during this time, your focus from a professional perspective, from a personal perspective, was about observing injustice in the world. As you said, this activist thread has guided your life. And you invested your time and your energy into producing papers, into conducting research, into educating the public to make the world a better place. I wanted to ask Vivienne, Dr. Vivienne, during this...
No. Let's not get too formal here.
So Viv.
Yes, thank you. Now I feel like I'm all right.
Just wanted to ask, during this period, because when you are having such a public face, I wanted to ask, what was going on for you personally during this time?
Well, that's a good question. Well, initially, I got into my first relationship. So the woman I first fell in love with became my partner. That relationship lasted only 10 years. And that was really my fault in a way. We had a wonderful relationship, but there were a few things that, I was very naive. I was totally inexperienced in relationships. She was also, had never been in a gay relationship. So really those, some things that were kind of that we struggled with, which I wouldn't do now because I wouldn't have done 10 years later, they actually created some issues. And I then began, foolishly, I'll say, but in those days, I had gone into a full-time relationship very young. And then by the time I was in my 30s, I felt like I'd been in a marriage for a long time, you see. So I started to, just look around and think about, what would it be like with other people and that sort of thing. And I'm saying this now because, it was not something that I am proud of. It's not something to be ashamed of, but I was just doing what young people do. I was exploring my sexuality, exploring the whole world and so on. And so I left that relationship and but never lost my love for my partner. And even many, just some years ago, she developed early dementia, and I was with her. I was with her when she was dying, with her when she died. So she was my true love, that was for sure. But other than that, I was going out and I was getting into music and so on. I had a sort of musical background as well. And I joined up with another lesbian who was a professional musician. I was not, I was very amateur. But we set up a duo, a musical duo that she was asked to play at this gay pub in the city. And so for 2 years, we had this, and every Tuesday night we'd get all dressed up and go in, and it was supposed to be a lesbian night, right? And they had different themes. Well, at this stage, they said, well, we've had this theme and that theme and whatever theme in music. So now we've decided we'll have a country theme, right? Well, I was not particularly a country music person at that stage, but I kind of got into it. So anyway, so I got dressed up. I had this little short country skirt, leather skirt with a fringe on it. It was split up to the hips, and, and a low cut sort of top and a cowgirl hat and all the whole bit, right? And I played guitar and sang, and my partner played keyboards and sang. So there we were in a pub singing songs and having a great fun. And to me, that was a fabulous way. Again, I'll bring it back to the Jewishness. We're a cultured people. We do music, or we do lots of creative things, and we often have professions as well, right? We're multidimensional. And so he was a great example. So people used to come along just because they'd heard about the singing psychologist, as they called me, and they wanted to hear what was happening. So anyway, so that happened, and as we would say, we sang until they sold the pub out from under us, and then we had to finish. So we had lots of great times, and there was a very busy gay scene by this stage, 80s and 90s. The 90s changed things a bit, because in the 1990s, from 1990, things became more conservative. So I felt very lucky because, in the 70s, of course, the 70s was people often talk about it being a very liberating time, that people were, sexually quite open and doing a whole lot of new things. And they were, the beach in Perth, which was the nude beach, was absolutely chockers, filled with people all over the place. If you talk to people now, they wouldn't do it at all, what we were doing then. So there was a great, open, liberating time. And then, but by the 90s, things started to close down a bit. And it was very interesting. It became quite conservative. Actually, to be honest, I was really intending to be an academic. And but when I got to the point where I was starting to look for academic jobs, and this was by sort of looking towards the 90s, everything closed down. And I think, being a feminist didn't help. I'd been obviously strong feminist, and those days the feminist movement was just kind of getting going. That was another whole exciting element as well. And I felt that didn't go down well, and it didn't go down well that I was obviously openly gay, and that I worked in the sexuality area. So there were a lot of things happening there. And that's why I went into private practice, actually. But anyway, that turned out to be a better thing, I think, because in private practice, I got to really work with people as opposed to just thinking theoretically about them in my head. Kept me grounded. Right? So in terms of personal things, well, I did get into other relationships, of course, and did all that sort of thing. I didn't have kids because in those days we didn't. It never occurred to anyone that you could actually be lesbian and have a child. And certainly gay marriage was not even discussed. So, but we were, in Perth, in WA, we were still working on getting decriminalisation of homosexuality up until through the 80s. So we had a lot of work to do. And but there was always fun. There were always lesbian parties. There was always gay nightclubs there, and there were lots of things. And of course, we always had the gay games, which is our gay Olympic Games, and all these kinds of things were really fun things that allowed us to just relax and be ourselves. But I notice, you see, it's not the same as nowadays. If there's certainly I don't know about parts of Australia, but in WA, what were the gay bars really, or gay pubs, or gay nightclubs are very, mixed. There's, that whole gay, gay, straight division has kind of disappeared. And I think that's good. I like that. But back in the old days, it was, you know, you wanted to be with other people like yourself just so you could relax and not constantly be on your guard. How does that sound? Does that cover the personal side?
It does. Um, so you've had many moments in your life where you've had to, it sounds to me, where you've had to, uh, where you've encountered opposition to the beliefs and the values
Mm,
and the perspective that you're coming from. And despite that, you have achieved really inspirational things. So I wanted to ask you,
mm.
in those moments, what gave you strength?
Hmm. Good question. You know, it's hard when you get to my age to think back to what you were doing when you were 30 or 40 in terms of what kept you going. But I think to some extent, it was naivety really as well. Like, I think, you know, when you're young, and I mean, I love seeing the younger generation now fighting for all sorts of things. These days, it might be climate change or whatever, but you have an energy and you have an absolute belief in yourself as being right, right? And uh, obviously that can annoy a lot of older people, but that sort of confidence, I think, carries you through, and that absolute belief. I mean, I remember once when we were trying to get decriminalisation of homosexuality in, and I was talking on the phone to a guy. He was a minister. He was one of the politicians, a minister in one of the governments, very well known, and he was so anti-gay. And I had rung him to talk to him because he was in the process of drafting up a bill. And I remember saying to him something about trying to tell him that, you know, he had to sort of stop doing what he was doing and, you know, be supportive. And he was adamant he wasn't going to change anything. And I remember saying, well, then, Mr. Whoever he was, all I can tell you is that history is on my side, not yours. And then he just hung up, bang. Now, that's that sort of arrogance, if you like, and absolute determination and belief that comes with youth, with an energy of youth. And I don't have that now. I mean, I'm probably a little bit, like in those days, it would have been very hard to have touched me, you know, say something horrible and I would get so angry back that it wouldn't really affect me. And as you get older, you lose some of that kind of, you know, sort of thorniness, I suppose, which allows you to survive. But then I think you go into something else, and I think then you use something that I would probably call a wisdom. Because what happens is, as you get older and older, you learn things, you learn all sorts of things, and you absorb all those new things, and you put them in and mix them up with what you've learnt in previous times. And that gives you a sort of an understanding and a solidness in your ideas that, and it takes you into another level. So you're not just drawing on some facts. You're not going, okay, I'm going to read all the facts on this. And like I would have done when I was early giving a talk when I was younger about, say, homosexuality, I'd pull out a whole lot of facts and so on. But when you're older, you just put it all together and you create a kind of an intuitive sort of, I guess it's wisdom. And so that can give you some confidence as well. But you have to protect yourself. I mean, at the moment, I'm writing another theory on attractions, and it's very broad, and I've been doing it for many, many years, longer than Darwin ever spent on his theory, but then I'm not Darwin by any means. But so I've been writing this book, but I do try and avoid reading some things, especially, and I hate to say this, but I try and avoid reading a lot of American literature. And the reason for that is that there are a lot of people saying things that I wouldn't agree with. And what happens though is if you read a lot of research of people saying something quite opposite of what you're saying, it's easy for you to lose your focus. It's easy for you to start going, oh, hang on, or maybe what I'm saying, maybe I should soften it a bit, or maybe I shouldn't be so like this. Maybe I should add their ideas in, or maybe, and you start to lose your sense of your center and your strength and your ideas, right? Now, that's the worst thing you can do as a theorist or as a writer or in any respect. Sure, you have to think this else. I'm not saying completely ignore what others are saying, but you have to also recognize that if you feel that you're going to lose your own belief systems because you're listening too much to other people who are different to you, then you have to pull back. It's okay to pull back and go, no, I've got to stay strong in where I am, in what I believe. And so, so I think that's what kind of helps me now, protecting myself a bit.
So it's now 2020, and same-sex marriage is legalized in Australia.
Yes.
We now are able to talk about trans issues, non-binary, people who are asexual, people who are on the autism spectrum within the queer community. Sorry, I'm not sure if queer is a word that you're
of course,
identify.
I'm used to every word.
Um,
And there's Indigenous groups as well coming into it. Yes,
of course.
Yes.
With the new redesigned pride flag as well, which is really exciting. So as someone who has a broader perspective than some of the other people I've interviewed, do you have any thoughts on where we are today versus where we were?
Well, clearly we have a freedom to be ourselves in a way that we just could not have done when I first came out, right? But at the same time, sometimes people will say to me, oh, well, isn't your theory is probably a bit out of date now, because in the stages that I talk about in my early theory, I talk about the gay pride stage. And that's a stage where, like before that, we get to the gay acceptance stage where we say, well, I accept myself as being gay, that's great, and and I'm going to go out and I'm going to do this, that, the other. But following that, I said, well, there's actually a gay pride stage, because sometimes we have to face up to the way that other gay people are treated, and that creates we get a sense of a them and us, it's them versus us. And so the gay pride stage was a stage when someone said, hang on a moment, gay people are great and we're really good and and it kind of balances out some of the negativity that exists. Now, so some people are now saying, well, isn't that out of date now? We don't have to do that. And I've actually, and I gave a paper on this actually in a Sydney conference some years ago. Well, the thing is, we have to be very careful we don't generalise. We're not all in the same boat. If you go into a country town, small country town, you may not feel as free there as you do in the city. If you go into certain religious settings, you may not feel you can be yourself as much, and so on. I think we all know that. So what I think we have to, certainly things are changing, and I don't think the idea of having to announce that you're gay or lesbian or bisexual or binary or this or that, I don't think that is as important, but people are still obviously doing that. That's where we've been. I think the next phase, hopefully, will be, this is in a sense what I'm writing about now, where I think we have to go into a phase where we don't have to put so much attention on the identity that we want to adopt. Now, I do feel we have what I call the tyranny of identity now, which is that people feel that whatever their experience is, whether they're pan or pansexual or demisexual, or whatever words they want to use for themselves, right? Words people are finding, I understand why they're doing it. They're saying, well, hang on, this is what I'm experiencing, and that's not really quite what you're experiencing. So I don't want to be given your label. I want to find something that fits me, right? But I want to see us get to the next level, which is where we don't need those labels at all. What that means is, if we can just say, well, you know what? The way we behave sexually, romantically, in a relationship, there are all sorts of variations. That's the human condition. We vary. I mean, we would, if we think of something else, whether it be sport or music interests or whatever, we allow ourselves to have a whole variety of things. We know that that person over there might not like the same music as we do. We don't have to find a label to put on to two different people with two different kind of music tastes. And so that's where I really want, and I hope that we go, where we just simply say, well, we all have our own particular way of doing things. There's an enormous amount of variety, far more than the labels that people keep inventing. I mean, I think the last list I counted was, it was about 150 gender/sexuality labels, right? Well, we can keep going. Every single person could find their own label if we want, but what's the point? What does that do? It actually keeps dividing us. It keeps separating us from each other. So that's my dream. So I'm planning to be around long enough to see that happen, where we just get beyond the labels. We're post-identity, right? And we don't need it. What do you think, Jared? Do you think that will happen?
Well, once you publish your book, then everybody who's watching this, I'm sure, will take a copy, and all it takes is to read an idea, and that sparks a movement.
Well, in my book, I actually do, I do use the word orientation, but I offer a different way of looking at it so that it does allow us to go beyond these identity labels. So, all right, watch this space, but don't expect anything just yet. I'm still writing.
I have one or two questions, more questions, if that's
Yes,
okay.
sure.
So you've spoken a lot about your journey through through the LGBT space over the past number of decades. I just wanted to ask you, in recent years, what has Judaism meant to you, if anything?
Well, that's actually a good question, because I feel in the last few years I've struggled a bit with my Judaism, not with being Jewish, absolutely not. There's never been any question there. But in a way, I don't think I ever got beyond the not belonging thing, even though there are plenty of Jewish gay people around now who would go to services and belong to, a synagogue openly. But I mean, this is probably more of a personal thing, because I belong to one synagogue, and I didn't feel particularly like it suited me, and so I decided not to renew that membership. But I haven't been able to yet find another place where I feel like I belong. Now, when I was in Melbourne earlier in the year, just before COVID, I did what I usually do, and I went along to the synagogue. What was it? What is it?
Temple Beth Israel.
Yes, I went there, and another one to where, of course, being gay is fine, and I really enjoyed that. Went with family, and so it's funny, because I keep looking for the right place for me to go, but at the same time, my Judaism is actually bigger than actually attending a service. And I do a lot of reading of Jewish philosophers and Jewish ideas, and I follow. As part of my reading, my preparation for my book, I do a lot of reading anyway, and of course, a lot of these authors are Jewish in areas such as neuroscience and so on. So I follow them. So I think what I'm actually hankering for is a some sort of wonderfully, and this is very idealistic, but some wonderfully wonderfully sort of philosophical, like a discussion group, a Jewish discussion group at a reasonable level where there's all sorts of great ideas being exchanged, about Judaism and the rest of the world, of course. And so I kind of see myself fitting into this wonderful group where I go along and have all these, and have that happen. So, if you hear of anything, let me know. So I just, in some way, I think I belong back in the world way before I was born, when people in Europe used to get together in the certain parts of a city that was often called the intellectuals, and they would sit around. And I actually saw this. Actually, there's an interesting story. I was in Turkey. I'd been asked to give a paper at a conference in Turkey some years ago, and the woman who was leading the conference said to me in a break at the conference, "Come with me, I want to show you the intellectual quarter." Now, coming from Australia, where we are anti-intellectual, and we have a very alive tall poppy phenomenon here, that was quite an interesting experience, because what happened is she led me through the streets till we found this area, and she said, "Here it is." Well, what it was a whole lot of cafes, and in those cafes were groups of people sitting around having wonderfully lively discussions and throwing ideas around, and I just wanted to be there. I just wanted to go in there. And so that's, I think, what I'm missing. That's what I feel I'm missing, that kind of wonderfully alive European tradition. So I think that, because obviously my family come from Europe, as many of us do, Eastern Europe, and I think that I've got some DNA there that just keeps popping out from those kinds of times.
I have one final question for you, Vivienne. Vivmeister.
I think we got back to Viv, hadn't we?
Yeah, we're back to
Yeah,
Viv.
we started there. I don't know. You keep slipping off the wagon into these very formal things.
So Viv, I have one final question for you. I'd like to go all the way back to the very beginning. You are young, you are discovering the world, you are growing up in this Jewish environment and slowly taking in all these ideas and being so curious about the world. And your journey is just starting. And I just wanted to ask, if you had a chance to speak to her, what would you say?
Ooh, that is a good question. Yes. I think I would say that this journey, the journey ahead of you, can be joyful and it can be painful. It can be enlivening and it can be stifling. And whatever it brings, you simply have to keep going and try and always stay true to yourself. Always stay true to yourself. When I was in my teen years, which is later than what you're talking about, this motto adopted me. Do not go where the path may lead, go where there is no path and leave a trail. And I say that this motto adopted me because somehow I came across it, and when I did, I just knew that was me. So in a sense, that's what I've been doing, but probably I needed to tell my little self, when you take a new path that hasn't been trodden yet, sometimes it's not always easy, and you have to just keep walking one foot after the other, and you have to try and stay hopeful and stay joyful and stay believing in yourself. But sometimes you will lose that, because that's what life is. And so the trick is to be able to kind of get back up and find that core of you that you still believe in, and know that, yes, the world might throw things at you, no, but you still have to keep going, because you are still there. You haven't changed. And as you keep going, well, hopefully you'll get wiser, and it will be less, less sort of encroaching on who you are. How does that sound?
Sounds beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vivienne, for taking time out from your busy life to be part of the Pride in the Living Room project. I think that your words will really touch our viewers, and whether they have lived a piece of your journey or it's something new to them, I think everybody will be able to take away something really meaningful to them. So thank you so, so much.
Well, thank you, Jared. And I think that, I look at what you're doing, and I guess I can see some of myself there. You're doing some things. You're working on making the world a better place. You're sharing things. You're getting people to share with each other. And I think it's fantastic. I love learning from young people as well as older people. And I love being inspired by that energy that you have and the sort of directions you're taking. So hang in there and keep going, because you're going to make a difference, I know.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Here's to sharing our story in this moment and many more moments in the future.
Absolutely. And I certainly want to catch up. Anyone who's from Perth has got to come and have a coffee with me.
Sounds like a plan. Have a wonderful evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye.